So we are doing the Chapter 4 presentation by
Nigel Swenson,
Zishan Qureshi,
Mr Bugge,
and Andrew Ding.
So first we're going to talk about northern agriculture and its economy. In New England, independent farming villages were forming all over. However, New England could not solely depend on farming because the growing season was a lot shorter. They had to use their resources in order to stimulate their economy. Many farmers had to take on other crafts like carpentry or weaving, so their economy was mostly based on fishing, timber, and traditional staple crops. Unlike New England, the South's economy was based on plantations. In Virginia and Maryland, tobacco and cotton were the major crops of the time. Also, another major crop in the South was rice. Because the amount of labor involved in southern farms, the additional hands were needed for the economy to thrive and to produce all these three major crops. For this reason, slavery was more prominent in the South than in the North.
Now let's talk about the natives. The French got along quite well with the natives. They often traded along the Mississippi with them, and they formed communities and outposts with the natives. Many times, the French would live with the natives, and they often married the natives and formed communities. The Spanish, however, did not get along so well with the natives, and they were not so kind. They reduced the natives to a point of virtual slavery in order to pay for the conversion to the Christian faith and salvation that the Spanish brought. This was something that they did with many of their native tribes. The English also didn't get along well with the natives. Unlike the French, they viewed the natives as twisted and evil beings, and often pitted two tribes against one another to weaken them, and then eliminate the remaining tribe to take their land. In some cases, they would just attack the Indians to get land, or lash out in their anger, like they did in Bacon's Rebellion. They did do some trading with the natives, but not as much as they did as the French, and this resulted in the spread of disease. The British also tried to convert the natives to Christianity, which was not often met with open arms, and was sometimes met with violence, as the natives were unwilling to part with their traditions. The natives were also an important part in many wars that occurred in North America. For the French and Indian War, they sided with the French because they had already formed stable trading networks and alliances with them, and they would be able to keep their land if the French won, and everything would stay the way it was. In the French and Indian War, the natives were fairly strong because of their numbers and their familiarity with the terrain. They were also quite willing to join with the French because the French put their own troops fighting alongside the natives. They then sided with the British during the American Revolution because they could keep the land if the British won, instead of the colonies. But they were less powerful since less natives joined the British, and they were weaker after losing the French and Indian War.
The Age of Reason was a philosophical awakening. People became more optimistic about human nature, choosing to believe in human goodness rather than human evil. This led people to believe that humans were given the gift of learning by God and that they should make use of it. This was one of the core beliefs of the Age of Reason. The view was not only that it was in our best interest to learn to make our lives better, but it was also our God-given duty. As a result of this belief, abolition began, as people began to think that slavery went against this God-given duty by preventing the slaves to learn or be human. In addition, people began to think that slavery went against the Christian way. The thirst for learning also led to the development of new colleges and schools. People began to want a better education for their children, instead of just trying to get money like the first set of colonies intended. In addition, the Age of Reason led to new scientific developments and discoveries such as the discovery of electricity. People also started to make practical use of the advancements that were made to make life better, as was the general feel of this period.
Let's talk about the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a religious revival movement along the east coast of America in the 18th century. The Great Awakening was preceded by a decline in religious faith, which is also one of its causes. Prior to the Great Awakening, church membership was low due to a low concentration of churches in some areas, and more significantly, religious apathy. This caused a notable reform in church practices and Christianity in general. The Great Awakening was a set of religious revivals. Awakening preachers focused on provoking emotions rather than thought. For example, Frelinghuysen started to preach to his people about the need to be saved, rather than delivering traditional sermons that were often long and to many churchgoers boring. Other notable preachers include Jonathan Edwards, who described hell in horrifying detail and berated people for their sins, and George Whitefield, who instilled the fear of hell and damnation in the people. The new method of preaching was much more effective than the monotony of previous clergy. The upper class largely lost their control over the church, which displeased them. The poor and middle classes felt as if they had gained the position in the church, which pleased them. The Great Awakening promoted religious tolerance among all sects of Christianity, as preachers stated that no one knew which Christians went to heaven. Evangelism and baptism, new sects of Christianity, formed as a result. This resulted in the separation of church and state, as no single sect could now control. Churches were no longer created as a result of government compulsion, but rather voluntary action. A principle known as lay exhorting also came about, which stated that any person could preach the truth. Women, the poor, and slaves took advantage of this by defying their assigned roles. The upper class was weakened because they no longer had special power within the church. The Great Awakening also emphasized the individual and brought feelings of self-worth to people. These feelings included interest for material objects and skepticism of authority, especially the monarchy.
So how does this all tie together? The natives, for one, posed less of a threat because they were weakened by the French and Indian War. People started to believe in self-government instead of monarchy. This was a result of the Great Awakening because now people thought everyone was on equal footing. Thirdly, the colonies started to unite because of their newfound common faith. As a result, they would fight together instead of fighting among themselves. And lastly, the people started to believe that they were valuable instead of lower class. So they are insulted by the British, like treating them like children. And this all led to the American Revolution.